and from the 14-inch guns of the battleships Congo and Haruna, cruising in Iron Bottom Sound. Meanwhile, the American codebreakers were back in business. In mid-October, they warned of a fresh concentration of Japanese transports, cruisers and carriers in the Solomons area. At the same time, the Japanese ground strength on the island matched that of the Marines. A fresh Japanese offensive, launched on the 24th of October, nearly broke through to Henderson Field. At one point, all that stood between the Japanese and Henderson Field was a single machine gun, manned by Sergeant John Basilone of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. It was enough to deny the Japanese their prize. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz was keenly aware that the Navy had not secured the waters around Guadalcanal. He warned his staff that he wanted no gloom or defeatism. Nimitz declared that the enemy is hurt too, but our job is to provide the fighting men with everything they need on Guadalcanal to fight this battle. We aren't going to do any good sitting here moaning or wringing our hands. The hard-driving Admiral William Bull Halsey was appointed C&C South Pacific. Fletcher, who'd been wounded in action, was replaced by Admiral Thomas Kincaid. By now, virtually the entire Japanese combined fleet, 5 carriers, 4 battleships, 10 cruisers and 29 destroyers, had sailed southward from Truk for a colossal bombardment and blockade operation. American cryptanalysts intensified their warnings of another Japanese offensive, although they could not pinpoint the precise date and location of the thrust. But Guadalcanal seemed to be the most likely objective. The main Japanese fleet was now deployed north of the Solomons. In Yamamoto's words, his warships were waiting to apprehend and annihilate any powerful forces in the area. Yamamoto again exercised overall command from the giant battleship Yamato at Truk in the Carolines group of islands. While the fighting swung to and fro around Henderson Field, the Japanese twice postponed the offensive, but time was running out for Yamamoto. The Japanese delay enabled the newly repaired Enterprise to complete the voyage from Pearl Harbor. She rendezvoused with Kincaid's task force and the carrier Hornet to patrol northeast of the Santa Cruz Islands. Bearing down on them were a Japanese advance force tasked with attacking Henderson Field, and a powerful striking force of 3 large carriers under Admiral Nagumo with orders to locate and destroy the American carriers. The scene was set for a potentially decisive carrier battle. After reconnaissance planes from both fleets had located their targets, the Japanese and American strike forces took off. Incredibly, the 2 strike forces passed within sight of each other. A handful of Japanese fighters peeled off to engage their American counterparts, but the rest flew on towards their distant targets. Shortly after 9 a.m., the Americans attacked the enemy carriers. There were direct hits on Shakaku and Zuiho. The Japanese escorts also came under fire. Within 10 minutes, the Americans were also under attack. Hornet was hit by bombs and torpedoes, and in a sinister new development, the carrier was also the target of 2 Japanese suicide planes. A second enemy wave scored more hits on Enterprise. A third damaged the cruiser San Juan. Enterprise was still able to take on aircraft, and Kinkaid decided to break off the action. The battleship South Dakota had also been hit by Japanese aircraft, but lived to fight another day. Hornet had not been so lucky. Now a wreck, she was abandoned and sunk the next day by Japanese destroyers. The Japanese had won a tactical victory, but they could not afford many more like it. They had lost 97 aircraft and 148 irreplaceable aircrew, including a high proportion of veteran squadron and section commanders. The Americans could afford their losses, but Admiral Nagumo's dead airmen were gone forever. But the Japanese were not prepared to concede defeat on Guadalcanal. In the first 2 weeks of November, their destroyers ran in thousands more troops. Now they outnumbered the Marines on the island. Traffic analysis and the fitful braking of JN-25 had once again painted a partial picture of Japanese intentions. The Americans steeled themselves to face another maximum enemy effort. Yamamoto planned another action at sea to coincide with a drive by his land forces on Henderson Field, now littered with wrecked aircraft, but still defiantly operational. Yamamoto issued his orders on the 8th of November. Within 24 hours, they had been largely decoded and were on the desk of Admiral Halsey. The Americans now anticipated a renewed assault on Guadalcanal and a drive on Henderson Field on the 12th of November. Halsey was given more details on the 10th, but he didn't know the size of Yamamoto's force, nor was he aware of Yamamoto's plans to bombard Henderson Field. The bulletin issued by Halsey on the 10th of November stated, "Big Japanese offensive against Guadalcanal to begin soon. Believe enemy striking force intends to hit that place, followed by attempted landings by army units from transports." At sea, Admiral Kondo, flying his flag in the heavy cruiser Otago, commanded a formidable advance force of 2 battleships, 6 cruisers, and 21 destroyers. They were accompanied by a bombardment group of 2 battleships, a light cruiser, and destroyers, and another support group drawn from 8th Fleet of cruisers and destroyers. Bearing down on Guadalcanal was a far larger force than the Americans anticipated. But in one vital respect, the Japanese were under strength. 3 carriers were on their way back to the home islands for repairs and fresh air crews. Only the carrier Junyo was at sea with Kondo. Halsey was in no better shape. He had only 1 carrier, Enterprise, undergoing repairs in New Caledonia, the battleships Washington and South Dakota, 8 cruisers, and 22 destroyers. But Halsey had no intention of avoiding battle. He ordered Kinkaid to sail on the 11th of November and be prepared to strike at enemy targets in the Guadalcanal area. Kondo's fleet positioned itself 150 miles north of Guadalcanal. The bombardment force was dispatched to shell Henderson Field, while Admiral Tanaka landed reinforcements at Tasafaronga Point, northwest of the American beachhead. On the night of the 12th of November, the bombardment force collided head-on with the Americans in Iron Bottom Sound, southeast of Savo Island. Another night battle ensued. Admiral Scott, aboard his flagship Atlanta, was killed, along with most of his senior commanders, when a shell from the battleship Hiei smashed into Atlanta's bridge. San Francisco's bridge was raked with fire by Kirishima, claiming the life of Admiral Callahan. Meanwhile, 8 American destroyers had joined a deadly duel with Hiei, closing to a range at which the battleship could not bring its heavy guns to bear. Hit more than 50 times, Hiei limped away. Kirishima also withdrew. The Japanese later scuttled Hiei, the first of their battleships to go down in the war. At sunset on the 14th of November, the American battleships Washington and South Dakota intercepted the second Japanese force under Admiral Kondo as it sailed eastward through the Solomon Sea to bombard Henderson Field. Long Lance torpedoes put 3 of the Americans' 4 destroyer escorts out of action. Then Kirishima crippled South Dakota. Moving in for the kill, Kirishima was engaged by Washington at a range of 5 miles. Washington opened fire by radar. Hit by a succession of broadsides, Kirishima was set ablaze and abandoned. Kondo, in the cruiser Tagao, sailed away at full speed. Meanwhile, Kinkaid's task force, including the wounded Enterprise, was heading north to engage Tanaka's convoy. Carrier-borne aircraft sank 7 of the Japanese transports. When the 4 survivors were grounded at Tassafaronga the next day, they were pounded by American dive bombers and artillery. The Tokyo Express had been derailed. Despite the American threat, the Express continued to mount operations. At the end of November, 8 destroyers crammed with troops got the better of a strong American cruiser force, but was unable to land any reinforcements. The American grip on the approaches to Guadalcanal was now tightening. The Japanese had lost none of their flair for night fighting, but the Americans had climbed a steep learning curve to match them in this deadly game. The Japanese now resorted to submarines to run in supplies to 17th Army. In the first week of December, they delivered 20 tons, a drop in the ocean. But once again, radio intelligence came to the aid of the Americans, giving advance warning of many of the submarine runs. On the 9th of December, radio intercepts enabled the Americans to arrange a PT boat ambush. 2 PT boats lay in wait for the submarine I-3, which obligingly surfaced between them and was sunk with a single torpedo. Victory on Guadalcanal was in sight. The Americans now held the upper hand at sea and in the air. A trickle of Japanese prisoners were giving themselves up. Many starving Japanese were killed by native villagers. Their severed heads decorated the island's longhouses for years to come. Vandergrift's battle-worn Marines were replaced by U.S. Army troops under the command of General Alexander M. Patch. Patch began to mop up. Vandergrift's dogged defense of Henderson Field had turned him into a national hero. The jealous MacArthur sourly remarked that the Marine commander clearly wanted to run for president. At their last gasp, the Japanese scored a final success. At the end of January 1943, Japanese aircraft flying from Rabaul attacked an American decoy reinforcement convoy heading for Guadalcanal in the hope of drawing Yamamoto into another battle.